So we want to study the sugya of shofar today, which is on Daf Chav Ches. But first, we'll start with Omar Rabba, the last two words on Chav Zayin Amid Beis. And we're talking about a case where someone heard part of a tkiya b'kashrus, only part of a tkiya. Omar Rabba, Shama mixas tkiya b'bar, u mixas tkiya al sfas habar. Now, if he hears a tkiya in the bar, then that's a problem because of what's called the, we would call it the haid, which means, when the sound bounces off the sides of the bar and he doesn't hear it directly, the sound of the shofar from the shofar. But then the Baal Tokea climbed up in the middle of a tkiya, I don't know how he did this acrobatic act, so that the Shomea could hear the second half of the tkiya outside the bar. And Rabbah is telling you yotza, which the Gemara understood to mean that if someone's standing on the outside of the bar, his friend is blowing inside the bar, but his friend climbs up outside of the bar so that he hears his friend blowing the second half of the show of the tkiya. He hears it outside the bar, which is bekashrus, and Rabbah says he was yotze, which is very strange because basically miktas hatkiya was bepaslus, and all he got to hear bekashrus was miktas tkiya at the end of the tkiya. He didn't hear the beginning of the tkiya bekashrus. It was kol havara, which means a haid, a sound that is not directly into his ears but bounces off. And yet Rabbah seems to be saying that it's sufficient to hear miktas tkiya and biyotzi achiyuv, even though the miktas rishona, the first half of the miktas, was bipsul. He gives another case, Rabbah, which seems to reflect the same idea. Miktas tkiya kodem shi'ala mura shachar. The mitzvah of shofar is a mitzvah by day. Yom trua yelachem. The day begins after alos hashachar, amud hashachar, and he heard the first half of the tkiya b'layla. The second half of the tkiya he heard by day. So mixas tkiya liachar sheyala amud hashachar lo yotza, and there seems to be an inconsistency in the ruling of Rabbah. On the one hand, in the case of Kol Havara, the last Miktas Tkiya is enough for him to be Yotze because it was Bekashrus. But in the case of Kodem Amud HaShachar and Liacha Amud HaShachar, Miktas Tkiya, the last half of the Tkiya which he heard after Amud HaShachar is not sufficient. So Amalei Abai turns to Rabbah and he says, Maishna Hasam. Why is it that in the last case of Liachar Sheyala Amud HaShachar Lo Yatza, B'bai Kula Tkiya B'chiyuva? You need that the whole, we'll call it the Chefza of the Tkiya, should be Bekashrus. Veleka, and now you only have the second half of the Tkiya, which is after Amud HaShachar, that you can be Yotze Yochiyu. Hachanami, why don't you apply that ruling consistently if Miktas Tkiya is not sufficient? That with regard to the case of B'toch HaBar, Be'ina Kula Tkiya B'chiyuva. Veleka, you heard the first half of the Tkiya inside the bar, the kol was a kol avara, and how could you be yotze with the second half of the Tkiya? I thought that there might be an interesting difference between the two cases. Before Amud HaShachar, there is no chiyuv, and therefore blowing a shofar before Amud HaShachar is like blowing a trumpet or a clarinet, whatever your favorite blowing instrument is.
Right.
Masechet in the case of the bar, he's a bar chiyuva. He hears a shofar, but it's mixed together with a kol avara. But at least you can define it or classify it as a potential shofar, and the kol shofar now has to meet the requirements of sof tkiya, but the first part of the tkiya could have been a valid tkiya. In other words, it's not that we mafkiya the shame tkiya. It has a shame tkiya. There's a psul. Kol avara is a psul. What should I say? Imagine a case where in the middle of his blowing of the shofar, he removed a certain stima, something that was clogging up the shofar. And the first half of the tkiya bounced off this stima. Stima meaning, like in a dentistry, where they plug you up with some filling.
Right.
So that's not considered yotze. That's a psul, but I wouldn't say it's not a kol shofar. So the Gemara answers the following. This is Rabbah talking to defend himself. Hachi hashta. Hasam laila lavzman chiyuvu klal. And maybe again, what it means is there's no such thing as tkiya shofar. You can't call it a shofar shel mitzvah or a kol shofar shel mitzvah when it's Laila. It's like if I would blow the shofar on Purim. Hacha, but here in the case of mixas tkiya bebar, bar makom chiyuvo. He's obligated. It's well after Amud HaShachar. The shofar is a shofar. The blowing is a blowing. And I'll prove it to you, says Ram. If you have doubts about whether or not there's still a status of a kol shofar in that half of the first half of the tkiya which he blew in the bar, li osan ha'omdu b'bar. What about someone who's sitting inside the bar? He doesn't hear the kol avara. He hears the kol directly from the shofar, and he would be yotzei his chiyuv. You have a problem because you don't hear the shofar directly. You hear the kol shofar as it bounces off. And it comes out that according to Rabba's premise here, when you're inside the bar, you fulfill your obligation because you hear the kol shofar directly. So the Gemara asks, "Meimer the Sava Rabba Shama sof tkiya below tchilas tkiya yatsa." That even though you were standing outside the bar and the first half of the tkiya was blown inside the bar, and you could not have fulfilled your obligation standing outside the bar with the first half of the blowing that was inside the bar, nevertheless yatsa. Why? Because you have sof tkiya without tchilas tkiya. Umemela, the corollary of that premise should be tchilas tkiya below sof tkiya. I'm going to add the word nami yotze. Let's say he hears the first half of the tkiya outside the bar, and then the Baal Tokea goes subterranean. For the second half of the tkiya, you should fulfill your chiyuv. The Gemara doesn't see any difference between tchilas tkiya or sof tkiya. In both cases, it's mixas tkiya. But Toshma, what then is Rabbah going to do with the following Mishnah, which we didn't get to yet? It's on Daf Lamed Gimel. Taka Barishona. He blows what's called a tkiya pshuta, which comes before the trua. Barishona means during Malchus. We divide up the Musaf into three parts, the first of which is Malchus. Umashach b'shniya kishtayim. Now, after he blows the trua, he needs a tkiya, and then he needs another tkiya for the next set of tkiya, trua, tkiya. Now, he blew the tkiya lachrea, a very long tkiya, long enough that if you divide it into two parts, it would be two tkiyos, both of which are long enough and are valid. So the double tkiya should count in both directions. He would have a tkiya lachrea following the trua, and that very same tkiya, because he was marif, can serve as the tkiya lefanea for the next trua. Ein biyad el achis. He's going to have to blow another tkiya for the subsequent trua to start a new tarat. V'amai. Why is that so? To salik lebetarte. If a mixas tkiya bekashrus is enough to fulfill your obligation. He's got a mixas tkiya from the beginning of the blowing in order to complete the tarat that he started. And now, in order to begin the oncoming tarat, he has a mixas tkiya. And your shita, Rabbi, is that mixas tkiya is enough to fulfill your obligation. Again, the Gemara is making a couple of jumps over here. I mean, he's blowing one continuous tkiya. I don't know how you would imagine dividing it up into two. If you have one long tkiya, you could be OT with the first half, the second half. Right. But one long tkiya was uninterrupted. How could that be chal for two different tkiyas? And the Gemara answers, you know what? It's enough to hear the tchilas tkiya. It's enough to hear the sof tkiya to be OT b'kashrus. But harochas hatkiya, long tkiya, cannot be ola for both the tkiya of one seder and the tkiya of the next seder. The peksuke tkiyasa mahadre me'adodi lo paskinon. And I think it's more or less how a svara, the Gemara says it better than we said it, that you can't be mafsik and separate one tkiya into two tkiyas. You cannot produce from one continuous tkiya two different tkiyos. Now the Gemara raises another objection to Rabbah. Toshma, what are you going to do with the Mishnah that we learned already on Daf Chav Zayin Amid Beis? Tokei l'tocha bar l'tocha dus l'tocha pitas. Im kol shofar shama yatsa, v'im kol avar shama lo yatsa. Excuse me. There's a bar, and there's something called a dus. A dus, as opposed to a bar, is built on top of the karka. And a pitas is a large barrel. He hears the shofar inside any of the above, and the Mishnah says it depends. Did he hear a direct blast of the shofar, went directly into his ears, or did he hear the kol havara as it bounced off the sides of the bar or the dus? Then lo yatsa. Amai. Gemara objects based on Rabbi's principle that you can be yotze with part of a tkiya. Lepok b'tchilas tkiya mikami til arav kola. Anytime you hear a kol shofar inside a bar, there's a fraction of a second before the kol bounces off the side when you hear the actual kol. It's true that the sof tkiya will be a kol avara, but the tchilas tkiya is behechsher. And you, Rabbi, hold that tchilas tkiya is enough to be yotze. And basically, from this question that the Gemara asks, the Gemara now shifts its understanding of Rabbah and substitutes a new understanding of Rabbah for the old one. That when Rabbah says mixas tkiya b'toch habar and mixas tkiya b'chutz labar yatsa, he's not talking about someone who's standing on the outside of the bar and he's listening to the kol shofar of his friend, and in the middle of the tkiya, the shofar, or the tokei, I should say, goes out of the bar. He climbs up out of the bar in the midway through his tkiya. Kikama Rabbah, but rather, what's the case of Rabbah? V'tokea v'ola l'nafshe. We're not talking about listening to your friend's tkiya. When you listen to your friend's tkiya, and in the midway in the tkiya, he climbs up out of the bar so that you hear the shofar, sof tkiya lo yatsa. But what about the tokea himself? True, he cannot be motzi others yidei chovaso, but he himself could be yotze because he heard the tchilas tkiya inside the bar, and now he climbs up outside the bar and he hears the sof tkiya. So we have a principle now, l'gabe atzmo, meaning as far as the tokei himself is concerned, we can say that when he blows inside the bar and then continues with that tkiya outside the bar, and it's considered the kashrus mitchila v'yad sof.
Is it continuous? There's no break in the middle where it's bouncing off the board. It's not kosher.
I think what the Gemara is assuming is that we only have a problem of bouncing off the bar for those who are outside the bar, but he's inside the bar.
I see. Okay, so for him it's continuous.
And when he gets to the sof tekiah, he's outside the bar.
Right, okay.
So Mimanavshach, he has the tekiah b'kashus. The first half is b'kashus because he's inside the bar. And as we said earlier, anyone could be yotze with his tekiah if they're inside the bar.
Okay.
It's true that the fellow, his friend outside the bar can't be yotze, but now he climbs up as he's blowing the tekiah. So he hears the second half of the tekiah outside the bar, and the first half of the tekiah, he was inside the bar. The Gemara is so convinced that this is Rabba's view. The Gemara wants to know, what is the chiddush of Rabba? You know, how could I even entertain the different idea that he would not be yotze v'chiv? The Gemara says, Zimnin de mapik reshet, vakati shofar babar, as he's climbing up step by step out of the bar, his head and his ears climb up above the bar, but his shofar is still inside the bar. Imagine a case where he's blowing on an angle, a downward angle.
Right.
And in such a case, part of the shofar he's going to hear as he's climbing up, meaning he gets to the point where he's above the karka of the bar, but the shofar is still blowing inside the bar.
Right.
And if not for Rabbah, I would have said this is a case of mikzas tekiah, because until he finally lifts the shofar out of the bar to where his ears are, he hasn't heard a complete tekiah. And now we want to say, well, but he heard the end of the tekiah. And kamash malan, now I have two possibilities to understand this kamash malan, the final maskana of Rabbah. One is to say that we're not choshesh, we don't really believe that we have to worry about the possibility that he held the shofar in such a way that it's not level with his head horizontally, but it's vertically down, dipping below the bar. And there's another possibility that Rabbah might say that this is a case of tchila v'sof, meaning he has a tchilas tekiah before he climbs out of the bar. He has a sof tekiah when he got out of the bar. The problem is with that part of the tekiah inside, which is sandwiched on both sides with a tekiah and a sof that are kashrus. And the chiddush of Rabbah is, in the Kamash Malon, that despite the fact that there's one part of the kol shofar that he heard b'havara, but nevertheless, since we have the tekiah and we have the sof, and it was one continuous blowing, we can now integrate the tekiah with the sof, and we have enough for a kol shofar. Omar Rabbi Yehuda b'shofar shal ola lo yiska. You will magdish a carbon as an ola. And now he wants to cut off the horn of the animal and use it as a shofar. Lo yiska. We don't want to let him use this. It's not clear why. The Gemara is going to try to figure out if there's an Isur Me'ilah here, because it's a shofar shal ola. So in the case of an ola, then b'diavad, he shouldn't have done it, but he blew with the shofar shal ola, and he was yotze. But if he did the same exact thing with a shofar shal shlamim, lo yotze. My timer. Why do you differentiate between shal ola and shal shlamim? I mean, mimanavshach. Either you hold there's no me'ilah, and even in the case of shlamim, he should have been yotze. If there's me'ilah, it's a mitzvah baba vera, and he wouldn't be yotze even with a shofar shal ola. So where is there a logical distinction between a shofar shal ola and a shofar shal shlamim? More answers, ola bas me'ilahi. This is really counterintuitive. The reason why he's Yotze with a shofar shalol again to the Eved is dafka because there's Me'ilah in shofar shalol. And the reason why he's not Yotze in the case of a shofar shel shlamim is because there is no Me'ilah in the shofar shel shlamim. That's counterintuitive to say the least. Ola bas Me'ilahi kevan de malba nafkale lechulin. We have a principle in Me'ilah that after Me'ilah, the Hegdesh loses its status as Hegdesh and it becomes Chulin. Now, when he begins to blow the shofar, again, we'll have to see how this works out with Tchilas Tkiyah, the last sugya that we did. But when the moment, the split second that he starts blowing on the shofar, he was Moel. And as a result of that, Me'ilah, the shofar was Yatza L'chulin, even though it came from an animal that was an Olah. But since it's Me'ilah in Olah, hence, in this case of shofar shel Olah, Yatza. Why? Because immediately with the beginning of the Tkiyah, when he violates Nisa Me'ilah in a Karban Olah, Yatza L'chulin. That's the nature of Me'ilah. But in the case of Shlamim, Lav b'nei Me'ilah ninu, there's no din of Me'ilah because Shlam al Kachim Kalin, and there's no Me'ilah in Kachim Kalin. Isurahu derachiv b'hu. He's not allowed to have Hana from Kachim, and that applies even in this case of a Karban Shlam. So let's go over it. Shlamim has no Me'ilah. Why? Because we said it's Kachim Kalin. And how do we know that there's no Me'ilah in Kachim Kalin? So here Rashi differentiates between the Emurim, which have to be burnt on the Mizbeach, and the Basar. So we're talking about a Karban Shlomim after the Kohen has completed the 4 Avodos, which culminate with Zrikas Adam. The Zrikas Adam is Mati the Murim Torah and Mati the Basar L'Achila. And here the Achila is even to the Achila's Bailam, even if they're not Kohen. And we have a principle that there's no Me'ilah B'Kachim Kalim because it's Mammon Bailam. Me'ilah means misappropriating that which is owned by Hegdesh. But in the case of Basar Shlamim, where the Torah was Mezakeh the Bailam to eat the Basar, there's no Me'ilah because there's no Mammon Hegdesh. It's Mammon Bailam. Again, this is only after Zrika. I mean, before Zrika, it's much more complicated because then we have a Murim mixed in with the Basar, and a Murim for sure is Mammon Hegdish. It's not Mammon Bailam. Now, as a result of this kula, this leniency in Shlomim, we produce a chumrah as far as shofar is concerned. So the kula is that since the Bailim will eat the basar, therefore they have personal ownership on the basar, and it doesn't belong fully to Hegdesh, and there's no Me'ilah. Now, if there's no Me'ilah, is lo yatsa l'chulin. And we have to understand that even though Shlamim, a Karban Shlam doesn't lend itself to Me'ilah, but it still has a din of Kachim, albeit Kachim Kalim, and the Nafkamina is Me'ilah. That even in Kachim Kalim, there's Me'ilah. So Bishlam, in the case of a Karban Olah, where as he blows the shofar and benefits from the shofar, and he's Moel in the Hegdesh of and therefore it's Yatzel L'Chulin, so he heard the shofar B'Chulin, that's fine. But in the case of of shofar Shel Shlamim, where there's no Me'ilah, because again, there's Bailus private ownership of the Bailam of the Karban in the case of Kachim Kalim, So it's not Yotzi L'chulin. And if it's not Yotzi L'chulin, you're not allowed to benefit from it. It's a shofar shel hegdesh. It's not chulin. And here we have to add a concept called mitzvah baba avera. Are you familiar with that? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Mitzvah baba avera.
Yeah. Of course.
Okay. Now, with regard to kudshim, there are two different concepts, and sometimes people confuse them. One is me'ilah, and the other is isur hana. The nafkamina is going to be, in the case of shlomim, that even though shlomim after zrika do not lend themselves to me'ilah, but they're still an isur hana. You know, have private, personal benefit from shlomim, from kudshim. Hence, in the case of a tokea b'shofar shel shlomim, he has in effect benefited from a carbon shlomim, which is also bana. Again, me'ilah is not guilty for because the violin are allowed to eat the basar. I mean, they own the basar. But as far as the isur hana is concerned, he violates the isur hana. And therefore, it's mitzvah baba avera. But here, we come head up, again, a collision against the brick wall. And that's called mitzvos lav lehenosnim. When he benefits from the shofar of shlomim, that's not a violation of isur hana. He's doing it for the purpose of a mitzvah. That's not l'shem hana, and therefore he doesn't violate the isur hana. So how could the Gemara tell me that if he blows a shofar shel shlomim, lo yatsa, because it's hegdesh and he's violating isur hana? What kind of isur hana? This is mitzvah slav lenos. The Gemara says, "Emas moal lebasar de taka, kika taka be surah taka." Since the shofar does not lose its status as hegdesh, despite what normally would be me'ilah, it remains hegdesh. It's not yotza l'chulin. Therefore, he's not allowed to benefit from kudshim, from hegdesh. In this case, kudshim kalim of shlomim. Now, I'm not sure why is the Gemara emphasizing here to why it's relevant. Emas mal lebasar detaka. I'm sorry. Well, I got confused. We talk about a shofar shel ola, and Rav Yehuda says that in the case of a shofar shel ola, kevan demal yotza l'chulin, and therefore yotzi de chovasa. He's blowing a shofar shel chulin. So that's what Rava pounces on him. He says, wait a second, there's something wrong with the sequence over here. From a time perspective, you're going to tell me that because of Me'ilah, it's Yotze L'chulin, therefore he could be Yotze, it's not a mitzvah baba avera to be Yotze by hearing the kol shofar. But wait a second, the Me'ilah is after the Tkiyah. That's when he benefited from the shofar that belongs to Hegdesh. So how can you tell me that he was Yotze Yidei Chovaso? It's a mamish mitzvah baba avera because kika taka be surah taka. Because it's only going to be Yotze L'chulin later on. See, what I don't understand is why. I think I have an answer to my question. But here's the question I wanted to ask you. When he first starts blowing the shofar, that itself should be Me'ilah. But the Gemara says, no, that's not Me'ilah because he's not a Moel until he benefits by completing and achieving what he wanted to achieve.
Right.
So if that be the case, we have to wait until after the Kiyum HaMitzvah in order to make the shofar into chulin. By that time, it's too late because he was blowing with the shofar till Hegdesh. Now we're caught up in like a vicious cycle over here. Because in order to be Yotze, he needs the shofar to be chulin. But on the other hand, it only becomes chulin after he finishes the tekiah. Now, this whole sugya is odd. Again, I can't claim I'm an expert in Me'ilah. I learned only parts of Masechet Me'ilah in Boston many, many years ago with Rav Soloveitchik. But one thing I do remember about Me'ilah is that Me'ilah requires that you take something away from Hegdesh. In fact, the Gemara says, Kol Mara V'Reach, Ein Bo Mishum V'Reach, Ein Bo Mishum Me'ilah. Like, for example, the Gemara Pesachim says that when they came to fix the Kodesh Kadoshim, they would lower the workers in a box, with a pulley system. And they wouldn't be nene from the Hegdesh. So the Gemara asks, from the Kodesh Kadosh, the Gemara asks, well, Kol v'mara v'rei ein bo mishum me'ilah. So but the Gemara says, all right, there's no me'ilah, but nevertheless there's an Isur Hana. So why is the Gemara making a big deal here about the fact that after the tekiah, that's when he's a moel, and that's when the shofar becomes chulin. I don't get it. The me'ilah here is inapplicable. I mean, the category of me'ilah means when you take something away. He didn't take anything from the shofar. Shofar is perfectly intact. He's just listening to the call. Very difficult. Elam a Rava. So Rava is going to disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. Echad devi echad ze lo yotze. Just like you're not yotze in the case of a shofar shel shlamim, so too. All right, let's get that straight. Just like you're not yotze in the case of a shofar shel shlamim, so too you're not yotze with a shofar shel olah. Because again, what was your point in a shofar shel olah? That through me'ilah it's yotze l'chulin, but the me'ilah is only chal after he blows the shofar. Now we get to the principle that really determines all these halachas. What are you telling me? That he's benefiting from a shofar shel hegdesh? Oh no. Mitzvos lav lehenos nitnu. A hana for the sake of a mitzvah is not considered hana as far as the Isurei hana. So therefore, when a person blows a shofar shel hegdesh, echad zeh v'echad zeh yatsa, according to Rav. His final position is that he'll be yotze. And it matters not whether it's a shofar shel olah or a shofar shel shlamim. And that's called mitzvahs lav lehenos. So you want to tell me that it's a mitzvah b'avera because it's having a na from hegdesh, and therefore he's violating an isur me'ilah? No. There's no me'ilah. And why not? Because mitzvahs lav lehenos. If his hana is hana shel mitzvah, then we're going to say that he was yotze and he was not in violation of the Isur Hana and Hegdesh. Amar Rav Yehuda, v'shofar shel avodah zara lo yiskav v'yimtaka yotza, u'v'shofar shel ir hanidachas lo yiskav v'yimtaka lo yotza. And once again, my time, what's the difference between the two? In shofar shel avodah zara, yatsa. But in shofar shel iranidachas, lo yaska. And the Gemara answers, iranidachas kituse mechta shiura. Since the din is that anything that belongs to the iranidachas has to be burnt, and therefore it's considered already burnt, and therefore the shofar doesn't have a shear. What exactly is the shear of shofar? That's a Gemara back on Daf Chav Zayin. That he's holding the shofar, and part of the shofar you can see here, and part you could see there, forward and backwards. But in the case of shofar shel irani dachas, kituse mechta shiura, you don't have a shear. You may be able to hold the shofar in that way, but al pi din, in the legal sense, you don't have any shear here. There's nothing. It's totally ashes, even though it's not ashes, but you have to burn it. And therefore the Lach already considers it, anticipating the future, as ashes.
Right.
If I say I will not get any anah from you, mutal itkalo, his friend could blow the shofar for him, even though he's benefiting from it. Tkiya shel mitzvah, he's not blowing Yankee Doodle Dandy or Reverie. He's blowing a tkiya shvarim and a tkiya. I mean, in that case,
right,
he's listening to a tkiya shel mitzvah, and we're going to apply the principle of mitzvah slav lehenos. It's not a violation of the neder. Very interesting. The Gemara Nedarim as a case of hanas tashmichech olai, and he asks the hana of tashmich on himself, because mudar hana means you could ask any hana on yourself through neder. And the Gemara says that in this case we will not apply the principle of mitzvah lav lehenos. So I saw once in a sefer here, I have it somewhere here, Mishmeres Chaim from Reb Chaim Pinchas Scheinberg, and he writes that when the hana is the guf ha-mitzvah, it's part of the mitzvah itself, you don't apply mitzvah lav lehenos. But when the hana is extraneous to the mitzvah, the mitzvah is to hear the kol shofar. It's not to give hana or get hana. Then we apply the principle that it's a tkiya shel mitzvah and mitzvah lav lehenos. Hamudra hana mi shofar mutal itkarbo tkiya shel mitzvah. Let's say I have my own shofar. I know that Ari has a shofar. Anyway, so I have my own shofar, and I take a net that I won't benefit from the shofar. In such a case, I'm allowed to blow the shofar. Why? Because it's the same mitzvah and mitzvah lav lehenos. The Omar Rava hamuder hana mechavero maze olav mechatos. This is very interesting because here we're getting closer to that case in Nedarim that I mentioned before, where the hana is sort of built into the etzem ha-mitzvah. Why? Because I will lo be most hagsham. Believe it or not, it's hard to imagine, but even something like mechatos in the hot summer months can be considered a hana that your body is nana from it. So you have a physical benefit to your body. In the case of Mosag Shamim, when he has this concoction, which is made up of Efer Paraduma mixed in with Mayim Chaim and all this stuff. So in Mosag Shamim, he doesn't get any benefit whatsoever. It's cold out there, and the mechatas will just make him even colder. But if it's during Yemos Hachama, people go, you see the children during Yemos Hachama, they go into the sprinkles, the sprinklers, sprinklers, and let the water, sometimes they even open up hydrants, which is illegal. But all right, they're children, what can you do? Very dangerous, But in any event, that's considered hana during the summer months. And he was muder hana michavero. Hamudar Hanomi Mayon, he says, from this spring I will not get any benefit. Tovil bo tefillah shel mitzvah, but only b'yamos hagshamin. Avolo b'yamos hachama. Once again, during the hot months, when there's hanoas haguf, by cooling himself off, by jumping into this mayon, this spring. So in that case, he jumps in for the sake of tara from tumah. But nevertheless, if it's mimos hachama and he has hanoas haguf from the tefillah itself, then he violates his neder. Sholchule le'avud Shmuel. They asked the question of avud Shmuel. Kafo, he didn't want to eat the matzah. They forced him to eat the matzah. The ochal matzah on the first night of Pesach. Yotza. Is it possible that he was Yotze? The Gemara says, Kfo man. Who forced him? Ilem Kfo Shade. No, he's had a Ruach Ra, some sort of evil spirit that entered into him and forced him to blow the shofar, to eat the matzah. Then the truth is he has the status of a shota. And that's not a kiyum mitzvah. And I'm going to prove it to you. But Sanya, we have a brayso that says, "Itim cholam, itim shota, b'kshu cholam areu kipikechol dvara, shota areu kishota l'kol davar." So while he's being, overwhelmed by this disease that he has, and he's not thinking lucidly, clearly, he is a shota, which means he's patur min mitzvahs. And a ma'isa mitzvah of a shota is not a ma'isa mitzvah. Therefore, now that he's no longer under the spell of the shade, he would have to eat another kizayis matzah to replace the first one. Omar of Ashi Kitchef Kafo Parsian. He was forced by other people, Parsian, a non-Jew. I don't know why they forced him to eat the matzah. He doesn't give you much of an insight here. It's a very strange kind of thing. But again, even though he didn't have kavana, he was forced, he was compelled by the Parsian. And he had no kavanah, let's say, chova, nevertheless, he fulfills his mitzvah. And this is predicated on a Ravas also meres. Mitzvahs einom tzrichas kavanah, and therefore, hatokeh l'shir yotz. If a person blows the shofar on Rosh Hashana, not because he wants to fulfill his mitzvah, but in order to enjoy the wonderful sounds of the shofar, is pshita, the Gemara says, why do I need Rav? I mean, Rav is just applying the principle of Avud Shmuel in the case of shofar. But once we have this universal principle of mitzvos, Einam Tzrichas Kavanah, we're going to apply it to shofar just like we apply to matzah. Hainu hach. Maladetem, I would have thought Hasam there in the case of mitzvahs matzah. Echol matzah omrach manav ha'acham. He did a ma'aseh mitzvah of achilas matzah. You can't deny that. He didn't have kavanah, but the ma'aseh is a ma'aseh mitzvah, and therefore he's yotzei, even without kavanah l'shem mitzvah. And here we turn to Chav Ches Amid Beis. Aval hacha, in the case of shofar, zikron truah ksiv. The Torah requires kavanah saleh. And if he's blowing the shofar l'shem shir, atokei l'shir, he doesn't have a zikron truah kavanah saleh. And Haim Misasik Bialmahu. Vis-a-vis the Ma'aseh mitzvah, he's Misasik. He has no kavanah for the Tkiyas Zichron Trua, and that's called Misasik. Kamash Malon, Rava comes to teach me that even in the case of Tkiyas Shofar, you don't need kavanah mitzvah and Tokel Shir Yotz. Rashi says, Afal Gav de Misasiku Yotz. Very strange. Unless Rashi means that there's another component to the mitzvah of shofar, which is like matzah, the ma'aseh mitzvah, of just hearing the shofar, because in addition to the pasuk zichron true, we have another pasuk yom true. Okay, then here's where we're going to stop for now, and then pick up the balance of the daf a little bit later on.